Hi everyone, I'm Teacher Andrew. This is Dave. Today we're sitting out in the garden in a canoe and we'd like to read you one of my all-time favorite books. It's called Way For Ducklings by Robert McClosky. There's some fun scribbles from the previous owner. Mr. and Mrs. Mallard were looking for a place to live, but every time that Mr. Mallard saw what looked like a nice place, Mrs. Mallard said it was no good. There were sure to be foxes in the woods or turtles in the water, and she was not going to raise a family where there might be foxes or turtles. So she flew on and on. When they got to Boston, they felt too tired to fly any further. There was a nice pond in the public garden with a little island on it. This, the very place to spend the night, quacked Mrs. Mallard. So down they flapped. Next morning, they fished for their breakfast in the mud at the bottom of the pond, but they didn't find much. Just as they were getting ready to start on their way, a strange, enormous bird came by. It was pushing a boat full of people, and there was a man sitting on its back. "Good morning," quacked Mr. Mallard, being polite. The big bird was too proud to answer. The people on the boat threw peanuts into the water, so the Mallards followed them all around the pond, and they got another breakfast, better than the first. "I like this place," said Mrs. Mallard as they climbed out on the bank and waddled along. "Why don't we build a nest and raise our ducklings right in this pond? There are no foxes and no turtles, and the people will feed us peanuts. What could be better?" "Good," said Mr. Mallard, delighted that at last Mrs. Mallard had found a place that suited her. But... "Look out!" squawked Mrs. Mallard, all of a dither. "Oh, Davy, you want to go down in the boat, buddy? You go in the boat. You'll get run over." And when she got her breath, she added, "This is no place for babies with all those horrid things rushing about. We'll have to look somewhere else." So they flew over Beacon Hill and round the State House, but there was no place there. "Hey, Dave, you want to come back up?" They looked in Louisburg Square, but there was no water to swim in. Just a second, gotta get up, pick up Dave. Here you go, Davey. Whoa. Can you sit? Good boy. Then they flew over the Charles River. "This is better," quacked Mrs. Mallard. "That island looks like a nice, quiet place, and it's only a little way from the public garden." "Yes," said Mrs. Mallard, remembering her peanuts. "That looks just like the right place to hatch ducklings." Sit, Davy, sit. Good boy. So they chose a spot among the bushes near the water and they settled down to build their nests. And only just in time, for now they were beginning to molt. All their old wooden feathers started to drop out, and they would not be able to fly again until the new ones grew in. But of course they could swim, and one day they swam over to the park on the riverbank, and there they met a policeman called Michael. Michael fed them peanuts, and after that the Mallards called on Michael every day. After Mrs. Mallard had laid 8 eggs in the nest, she couldn't go visit Michael anymore because she had to sit on the eggs to keep them warm. She moved off the nest only to get a drink of water or to have her lunch, or to count the eggs and make sure that they were all there. One day the ducklings hatched out. First came Jack, then Cack, then Lack, then Mack, and Knack, and Whack, and Pack, and Quack. Mr. Mallard and Mrs. Mallard were bursting with pride. It was great responsibility taking care of so many ducklings, and it kept them very busy. It's okay, Davy. One day, Mr. Mallard decided that he'd like to take a trip to see what the rest of the river was like further on. So off he set. "I'll meet you in a week in the public garden," he quacked over his shoulder. "Take good care of the ducklings." "Don't worry," said Mrs. Mallard. I know all about bringing up children. And she did. She taught them how to swim and how to dive. She taught them how to walk in a line, to come when they were called, and to keep a safe distance from the bikes and the scooters and the other things on wheels. You trying to see the pictures, Dave? When at last she felt perfectly satisfied with them, she said one morning, "Come along, children, follow me." And before you could wink an eyelash, Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Whack, Pack, and Quack fell into line just as they had been taught. Mrs. Mallard led the way into the water, and they swam behind her to the opposite bank. Davy. There they waded ashore, and they waddled along until they came to the highway. Mrs. Mallard stepped out to cross the road. Honk, honk went the horns on the speeding cars. Quack went Mrs. Mallard as she tumbled back again. Quack, 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 quack went Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Whack, Pack, and Quack, just as loud as their little quackers could quack. The cars kept speeding by and honking, and Mrs. Mallard and the ducklings kept right on quack, quack, quacking. They made such a noise that Michael came running, waving his arms and blowing his whistle. Tweet, tweet, quack, 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 honk, 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 honk. He planted himself in the center of the road, raised one hand to stop the traffic, and beckoned with the other, the way policemen do, for Mrs. Mallard to cross over. As soon as Mrs. Mallard and the ducklings were safe on the other side and on their way down Mount Vernon Street, Michael rushed back to his police booth. He called Clancy at headquarters and he said, "There's a family of ducks walking down the street." And Clancy said, "Family of what?" "Ducks," yelled Michael. "Send a police car, quick." Meanwhile, Mrs. Mallard had reached the corner bookshop and turned into Charles Street with Cack, Jack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Whack, Pack, and Quack all marching in line behind her. Oh, hi, Dave. You want to get back up? Okay, buddy. Come here. Can you sit on my lap a little more? Like this? Down. Sit. Everyone stared. An old lady from Beacon Hill said, "Isn't it amazing?" And the man who swept the street said, "Well now, ain't that nice?" And when Mrs. Mallard heard them, she was so proud she tipped her nose in the air and walked along with an extra swing in her waddle. When they came to the corner of Beacon Street, there was a police car with 4 policemen that Clancy had sent from headquarters. The policemen held back the traffic so Mrs. Mallard and the ducklings could march across the street. Right on in to the public garden. Inside the gate, they all turned around to say thank you to the policeman, and the policeman smiled and waved goodbye. I'm gonna wave goodbye to the policeman. And when they reached the pond and swam across the little island, there was Mr. Mallard waiting for them, just as he had promised. The ducklings liked the new island so much that they decided to live there. All day long, they follow the swan boats and eat peanuts. And when night falls, they swim to their little island and they go to sleep. The end. Thanks for joining us. See you next time.